Interested in all things psychology? You are at the right place. Here, we bring exciting and thought-provoking ideas. We travel into our minds and some things out of this world. Welcome to the Psychology Debrief.
And welcome back to the channel. I'm joined today by Dr. Ilham Sebah, who's going to be discussing with me about the topic of communicating science to non-academic audiences. Thanks for joining me, Illy. I hope I don't kind of sort of embarrass you too much, but I did a little bit of kind of Googling of you before we came onto this call, just to kind of give a bit of context to some of our viewers who may not be fully familiar with your kind of background. But you've done quite a lot of work with kind of communicating science to sort of lay audiences. A kind of brief Google search revealed to me that you've, first of all, previously written articles for The Conversation. You've also been interviewed by outlets such as CNN, and also I believe you were on Canadian News. I think it was Canadian News recently, a news radio station in Canada. Yeah. And also I think perhaps maybe the biggest accolade of them all is you've done a TEDx talk as well, if I'm not mistaken, about resilience and other sorts of things. Our viewers can obviously find that last one on YouTube if they want to go and see you in action, look and kind of get a real expert talking about communicating science to sort of lay audiences. Obviously, viewers, don't do it right away. Stick on our video first, then go and check it out, but it will be in the description. Secondly, obviously, just in case Ted is watching, if you like what you see in the next 12-15 minutes, I am available to talk on many subjects, and hopefully Illy will help me improve my skills in the next 10-15 minutes or so. So Illy, I think first of all, before we get into, and I think what you've got is kind of three kind of key principles that you sort of think about when you talk about communicating sort of research and science to non-academic audiences. But before we kind of get into that, some of our viewers might be wondering, is this really a topic of conversation that's fully kind of relevant to me? It kind of sounds on initial value that unless you kind of stay in academia and you do what we do, which is research and sort of deal with science on a kind of daily basis, where you then may have to communicate it, doesn't really maybe beyond that scope have much relevance to maybe students. But I think that's probably a very narrow-sighted view. So maybe there are certain ways in which you can maybe just kind of outline it in the many different ways that sort of students might have to consider about how they communicate science to other people who are not scientists themselves.
Sure. So I think you're right in saying that it definitely has a lot of relevance. So it's not just necessarily because you want to do a PhD and communicate your findings to a lay audience, but if you think about life after uni, and I know a lot of our students are interested in clinical psychology, for instance, and within that field, you still have to be able to communicate quite complex information to a lay audience, i.e. the patients that you'll be working with, the team that you'll be working with. And then even if you do want to go off and do something completely different, it's really important to learn how to communicate. If you want to get into marketing, for instance, journalism, I think it's one of the most important skills that you can develop, the ability to communicate to an audience, but also to be able to communicate complex information, distill it into its kind of simplicity and relay that.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, really, it's a kind of skill that if you do a psychology degree, whether you stay in academia or not, it's going to be relevant to you in some way, shape or form. And perhaps maybe the most kind of obvious one that might be immediately after a student finishes their undergraduate degree is going out and talking to employers about what they learnt in their degree, maybe how it applies to what they're looking to do with that business and that sort of thing. So there is that kind of real broad use. And obviously sometimes as well, sometimes we actually will test our students a little bit about their ability to consider taking complex information and communicating it to a lay audience. So you might have an assignment, for example, that asks you to do some of these things. So if you do have an assignment like this, then maybe think a little bit about what Illy's about to kind of cover. So I think without further delay, I think you've got three suggestions. So let's go into your first, and then we'll go to your second and third.
Okay, great. So the first tip that I have is to ensure that your message is concise. And this is something that we teach throughout teaching in universities, to be able to write concisely is one thing, but to be able to communicate in a concise manner is really important. So the first thing I'll say is you have to understand your audience. And I think in this day and age, a lot of people have such short attention spans. So the more kind of concise and punchy that you can make your points, the more likely they are to pay attention, to stay engaged, and to remember the message that you're trying to communicate. So ensure that your message is concise. And one way of doing that is to have a really clear structure. So think of it as if you're writing a story. So some of the best speakers that you can think of are those that take you on a journey. They have a beginning, they have a middle, and they have an end. And within that really basic structure, they're putting in the main points. So that will be tip number one, is to ensure that your message is concise. You can be talking about a really broad topic. An example might be if you're talking about your final year project or your dissertation, it's obviously quite a broad field. So if you can try and just think about what are the main points that you're trying to get across, that's the first point that I would say. The second point, and this is something that I was told years ago when I used to do a lot of public speaking. And if you think about your audience members, they always want to have, something that they can remember. And this is very closely linked to the first point. And this is your message tweetable? So is your message tweetable? And what that essentially means is you should be communicating in a way that's clear enough that anybody in your audience can literally write down what you are saying and tweet it out. So what happens when we're communicating, or if we're in a job interview, if you're giving a public presentation, we tend to get really nervous. The concept of time is completely, warped. So we speak really, really quickly, and audience members just kind of switch off because they can't keep up with what we're saying. So it's really good to slow down, to pause, to ensure that the important messages that you're trying to get across are said in such a slow manner that anybody can say, that's such an interesting fact. So you might say 60% of psychology students go on to, become clinical psychologists. And if you say that nice and slowly, that's obviously not a fact. I've just kind of made that up, but it was clear enough for you to capture what I've said. And if it's interesting enough, you can put that in a tweet and tweet it out. So I always think whenever I present or give a presentation, I just think about slowing down, ensuring that my audience members can understand what I'm saying. So ensure that I'm clear, that I have clarity, and that each word is landing with my audience in order for them to capture what I'm saying. So just to repeat, the first tip is to ensure that your message is concise, that you have a clear structure to make it punchy. The second is to ensure that it's clear enough, slow enough, and I guess, enough to be put out into a tweet. And that I guess it links to the first point about ensuring that it's concise. Nobody's going to capture a really long tweet because of the word limit, so the character limit. And then the third point that I have is one thing that I always try and communicate to my students, and this is really important, again, when it comes to your assignments, but equally as important when it comes to communicating, is so what, who cares? And what I mean by that is, okay, so you've just communicated your findings or whatever it is that you're presenting, but why should the audience members care? Now, one thing that I think about is if somebody is paying to come and see you speak, they obviously want value for their money. Whether it's a free event or not, you should still be kind of thinking about this. And whenever you put, something together in order to communicate, it's good to think about what's your take-home message. What is the main thing that you want your audience members to go home remembering? So it doesn't necessarily have to be a presentation. It can be something that, like you mentioned, Sam, I wrote an article about a year ago now for The Conversation, and it was quite a broad topic. So it was on phone anxiety, but I was able to write it in such a concise manner, so it was no more than 700 to 800 words, and it had very clear, punchy points, bullet points, with a very clear take-home message. So if you read the article, you know exactly what it's about, you know what the kind of symptoms are, and you know what I want you to go away remembering. Another way to think about this is if you ever go to a conference, there will be plenty of speakers, but one way for you to stand out is to think about, you know, what is my take-home message? I'm going to keep drilling that in. I'm going to really emphasize that point so that the next day people are going to remember that's what I talked about, and that's what I want them to kind of take away from my talk. And if you have some sort of call to action, so if you're talking about, you know, something that's really important and you're trying to encourage students or your audience members to, it might be, you know, sleep better. So you might give them tips on how to improve their sleep, to reduce their caffeine consumption, so on and so forth. So in conclusion, the first point would be to ensure your message is concise. Think about it being tweetable, so in other words, digestible. And the last is, what's your take-home message? So try just thinking, why am I communicating this? Why do the audience members want to know this? And what do I want them leaving, remembering about my talk? So yeah, that would be my 3 main tips.
So when we suggested doing this kind of science communication sort of topic, and you told me a little bit about the 3 suggestions that you had, immediately I started to wonder about how I could use in my own kind of work. So what I thought about doing for this topic, can I now use your principles to good effect? So maybe in the next kind of 5 minutes, I can take what you've just said, see if I can apply it to something which is from my own work, and you can kind of give me a few head shakes or nods to sort of say whether I'm doing well or need to do further improvement. So what I did before I came onto this call was I looked at a recent paper that I published. What I'll do is I'm going to try and think about your 3 principles. Particularly, I'm going to focus on that idea of tweetable. So I'm going to try and create a tweet that kind of encapsulates the kind of story of the paper. And then what we'll do is when this gets released into the world, I'll also release the tweet at the same time, and we'll see if I sink or I swim. And that will be absolutely no reflection on your suggestions. It will be probably a reflection on my ability. So the paper that I have recently published is called Reach for the Stars, outing myself as, first of all, STEP's biggest fan there. Secondly, also, is that as all good research works, the title of the paper came first. The actual research itself just fit it in around what was clearly a good name for a paper. So the name of the paper is called Reach for the Stars, the role of academic contingent self-worth in statistics, anxiety, and learning. So first of all, it's probably worth just giving a bit of context in a sciencey way, and then we can work about how we can try and make it sort of less sciencey and more digestible, more tweetable. So what we did in this study was look at what's called academic contingent self-worth, and that's basically when your sense of self-esteem is kind of dependent on your what's called academic competence. So whether you feel that you're really good at being a student or really bad at being a student, that really makes up your kind of sense of self-esteem. It bears an outcome for how you evaluate yourself and how you feel about yourself. What we did in this study was we showed that in situations where basically when students are faced with a difficult test, they tend to what's called self-handicap. So students who pit their self-worth on their academic studies, when faced with a difficult test, they tend to self-handicap. And self-handicapping is essentially a strategy in which people can protect their sense of self-esteem when it's kind of believed to be on the line. So one kind of self-handicapping strategy is to kind of withdraw effort, which is what we looked at in the study. Because by withdrawing effort, then if you do fail, you can point to the fact that you didn't really put effort in your work and say, well, it doesn't really impinge on my ability as a student, it's because I didn't try. So that's my kind of sciencey way, at least in a very kind of brief snapshot, as to what the study did. Now I'm going to try and take your principles here and see if I can kind of digest them into something that makes it a little bit more digestible, more concise, simple, and importantly tweetable, because I don't have, the conversation hasn't come to me, unfortunately, and says, can you write an article about this? But maybe at the end, maybe they'll ask me at the end of this, this topic. So I think the first point that you said is about making it concise, making it a kind of clear story. Obviously, I can't really do a story in a kind of context of a tweet, but certainly concise and simple seems to be something that, when I was listening to you talk, seemed to come through. So one thing I thought was something that needs to be done is kind of simplify the technical terms that are going on, kind of sort of saying academic contingent self-worth, self-handicapping, etc., isn't very amenable to a kind of broader audience. So I thought, as a kind of good starting point for kind of trying to translate it into a simple message, I went with basing one's self-esteem on their academic studies leads to withdrawing effort when faced with difficult tests. So I've tried to now just keep it as a simple message, but also simplify the technicalities of the message, so it's kind of more understandable from a lay audience. So far, how do you think I'm doing?
Yeah, so far so good. I think you've been able to apply that first tip quite well. So you've made it clear.
Okay.
You've basically talked about what your paper is about, but simplified it. Could you, I'm just thinking, could you phrase that as a question, do you think? And the reason I say that is because when you see a tweet and it's a question, you're more kind of lured in to want to find out the answer.
Right.
So if you say, you know, does your self-esteem, rather than saying it as a statement, and then people can just see the paper. So I wonder if you can rephrase that so it's kind of a little bit more enticing as a question.
Yeah, so you could have something like, does basing your self-esteem on your academic studies lead to, you know, say withdrawing effort, question mark, or something. Okay, I like that idea. I hadn't thought about that. I got to your next point, tweetable, and I kind of went a slightly different route, and I'm interested to see what you think. So when I heard you sort of said, look, make it tweetable, I was like, okay, when I think about tweets, I think about that, as you kind of said, posing a question is a good example, but I was like, what's that thing that makes you want to click on, you know, whatever article it is? And I kind of thought sometimes I think of a tagline to, you know, like a movie, and you kind of have this tagline, you're like, oh, that sounds really cool. So I kind of was trying to come up with a tagline to start that kind of statement with. And I kind of came up with flight from failure, or maybe fleeing from failure. I liked the kind of alliteration of the 3 Fs. Yeah. What do you think about that? Does that make it now sound like, oh, this is much more interesting?
Yeah, I like flee from failure.
Okay.
I think that's quite, it has a catch to it. It has like a ring to it.
Okay, so we've got flee from failure, and then it's changing that statement that I said to a question, which was, so flee from failure, does basing one's self-esteem on their academic studies lead to withdrawing effort, question mark.
So I was going to say, can you really see how anybody scrolling on Twitter will think, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what the answer to that is, rather than if it's just a statement, because you've already told us the answer if it's a statement.
Yeah, I could, because I think what I've done is I've sort of said, I've told you now, you don't need to actually you don't need to read what I said. So yeah, I could definitely see the question makes it a lot more interesting and makes you want to click on it. So maybe we should frame this whole topic of the video being something like, is science communication a valuable skill, question mark, rather than anything else. So I'll remember that for when I title this podcast.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I think this is one of the biggest differences, because with academic papers, we're kind of trained and taught to tell our reader from the outset exactly what the paper's about, especially if you look at the abstract. And within the title, you can already tell what the paper's about. But I think when you're trying to capture an audience's attention, you have to think about, you know, how am I going to get them to click, like you say. So my article for the conversation was, it was such a simple title. I think it was Phone Anxiety, What is it and How to Get Over it. So it doesn't really give anything away in the title. So you have to just click in order to find out the answers to that.
Yeah, I can definitely see why I've got a lot of improvement to do. You really want to kind of kind of phrase it as like a movie. You don't tell them who really did the murder in the title. It would be a bit pointless if Star Wars was called he's the father of the other person. I mean, that would be the kind of pointless thing to do. Call it Star Wars. That sounds interesting. So I'll get to your third point, because this is where I kind of wonder now, given your suggestion about changing it to a question, how it will fit with the original structure I had. But I was thinking about when you said, I really liked what you said, sort of, so what, who cares? It made me really think more about what audience is reading this, and therefore how do I want to try and target reaching that audience. So I guess I started to think a little bit about trying to frame it away from an academic perspective, where you're kind of talking more about what the effect is and more about the kind of implication of it for the individual. So I kind of went and I changed my statement away from what the finding was to more about a broader implication about self-esteem. So I had flee from failure, and then I changed it to away from the statement about what we found to be how self-esteem, and again, I try to think about the tweet thing further here with the rest of my statement here. So how self-esteem can prevent us from going for gold, and how to not let it hold you back. What do you think?
Yeah, I like that. I like that.
Because I thought that would be, that's kind of, oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
And maybe it also answers your kind of point about not really saying maybe it kind of deals with the thing about sort of saying a question. I haven't asked a question there, but it holds back the real interesting answer to that conundrum about, well, why does it prevent us going for gold, and maybe how can we prevent it from holding us back? So that was the way that I chose to do it. And so if you agree, that's the tweet that I'm going to put out with this video, and we'll see how well I do it.
Yeah, I think that works, because actually everyone can relate to this topic. So you haven't kind of just, given it to just like the students, or you haven't chosen your select audience or targeted it at a particular audience. I think you've kept it quite clear, quite broad. So I think anybody coming across that tweet would be intrigued to know what it's about.
Yeah, and obviously, just to kind of reiterate what I said right at the beginning, Ted, if you're listening, we now have I'm very happy now. I've got the title, the conversation. If you want me to write an article about it, I am here. I'll just wait for your phone call. It's currently not going off, but who knows? Maybe soon.
I was just going to say, when you do put this video out, maybe you can just include their in there. You can say tips for writing for @ the conversation and speaking on @TED.
Yeah, I should do that. I'll tell you what, I've got a lot to learn with this whole social media. Before I did this, I was not on social media, and it's just like trying to learn a completely different way of doing things. So I'm still learning, and thank you so much, Illy, for helping me learn a bit more on this journey about how to communicate these things. It's been good fun. And hopefully I'll have you on again soon.
Yes, for sure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks
really
very
enjoyed
much.
this chat. Yeah. Speak soon. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for watching the Psychology Debrief. If you have any suggestions for new topics, quizzes, or any other content psychology related, feel free to get in touch via email or Twitter. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Bye!